The history of the ESRB adult-only rating is a fascinating one. Growing up, I always wondered why there was an AO rating. Surely having a rating for people 18 and up is a bit redundant when you already have a rating for people 17 and up. It's only a 1-year difference. It wasn't until later in my life that I was made aware that the adult-only rating is effectively a deliberate death sentence for games. Most retailers refuse to stock AO-rated games, much like how most retailers refuse to stock porn DVDs, because the rating is pretty much reserved for pornographic games, gambling games, and games with the most extreme of extreme gratuitous violence. Sometimes you'd even get a combination of these things, so it's something that makes sense when you look into it. One thing you'll notice while looking into it is that most AO-rated games are on PC. What with the PC being more open source, you don't have as much overhead while making games for the platform. Historically, if you had the funds, you could just make a PC game, so you can get away with having these extreme adult themes and still have your game sell relatively well. Back in the day through mail order, and these days through Steam. You don't get so many adult-only rated games on consoles, at least ones that actually get released, because traditionally, game development on consoles requires a publisher and a seal of approval by the manufacturer, and as such, have a lot more overhead and corporate requirements. Publishers like to make money, so anything that can hamper sales even by 1% is avoided at all costs. The Punisher, Fahrenheit, Manhunt 2, these are all games that originally had adult-only ratings when they were first submitted to the board, but were edited prior to release in order to meet an M rating. And then there's the curious case of a little PS1 game called Thrill Kill. A little game developed by Paradox Development and originally published by Virgin Interactive, but we'll get more into that later. It's a little known 4-player 3D brawler for the PS1 that was slated for a 1998 release, but it mysteriously vanished without a trace, never getting an official release. So what gives? What was it about this game that gave it an adult-only rating, and why was it cancelled instead of toned down for an M rating? Well, let's get into it. But before we get into the reasons why it was cancelled, let's take a look at the game's subject matter and really examine if an adult-only rating was warranted. So in the beta build of this game that I found, there's no clear indication of what this game's story is that I could find, but according to the internet, out of sheer lonely boredom, the goddess Maruka has gathered 10 damned souls from hell to fight for her amusement, with the winner earning their reincarnation. Each of these damned souls have a backstory for how they died and ended up in hell, that range from the funny, to the messed up, to the outright upsetting. Either way, each of these characters are distinctive in their designs and sensibilities, but they're each their own flavor of complete nutjob. And there are a few characters introduced later on which get interesting. In the third to last level, you'll fight a character named Cain, and the secondary boss before you fight Maruka is named Judas, which means they're going for some biblical theming in here, the former being the first murderer, and the latter being the man who sold out Jesus. But God knows why they went for biblical names when that's not a present theme in the game. Judas is a pair of conjoined twins attached at the waist, so one always acts as the other's legs. What that has to do with the biblical Judas, I have no idea. And Cain is an interesting case because he's an arsonist, when fire has nothing to do with Cain in the Bible. He killed his brother Abel with a rock. Although it is interesting how two separate pieces of fiction within a year of each other both introduced a character named Cain, both spelled in different ways, and both had fire powers. Either way, the biblical theming is completely superfluous, other than the fact that you're technically in hell, and the character selection is certainly interesting in an edgy, please see me after class kind of way. Which takes us to the combat. Thrill Kill proudly identifies as a BDSM-themed fighting game, and that's not really apparent other than some of the characters being dressed in various pieces of BDSM gear. If anything, it's just a regular 4-way fighting game with pretenses of being something more. Although having to use the term 4-way while describing this game is probably exactly what they wanted. Every level you're plopped into an arena with 3 other opponents, and you move around a small square environment attacking others while trying not to be attacked yourself. You have various types of attacks you can do like any number of fighting games, including a grapple for when they stubbornly refuse to stop blocking. It's fairly straightforward. Thrill Kill kind of has a unique gameplay formula. The best thing I can compare it to would probably be wrestling games, because those are also multi-character brawlers, and much like your average wrestling game, you also have finishing moves. As you land successful hits, you'll gradually build up your power bar, and once you fill your power bar up, you can do one of several different finishing moves, and each character will have roughly the same finishing move templates assigned to one of the buttons, although altered to fit their fighting style. You do this until there's one person standing, with the final finishing attack being a special character-specific one that you can do after being infused by lightning. It's funny, this game might actually be considered a contemporary of PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, which has a very similar premise for its combat engine, although despite having similar finishing move systems, Thrill Kill is elimination, so you attack and subsequently use your special until you're the last man standing. If you do compare this to wrestling games, even from its time, it's unfavorable because this game is fairly janky. Moving in 3D space wasn't really an easy thing to do in this period of time because it was before analog movement was really a thing on a mainstream level, so you had to rely on digitally moving in 3D space, which felt stiff as hell. And the specific characters you're targeting seems to be at the game's discretion rather than based on anything you're doing. The actual combat is fairly solid, with good hit connection and a real sense of weight behind your hits that make knocking people across the room fun. Plus, I enjoy that this is a game that you can't play defensively. You need to be aggressive in order to build up your power meter, because otherwise someone else will build up their power meter, and the CPU always has a habit of targeting you first. The structure of every run-through of the arcade mode is the same. You go through 6 4-player fights, and then you fight Judas and finally Maruka before getting your character's specific ending. Although I'm assuming one of the things that this version of the beta release doesn't have is what would end up being the actual endings, because looking at them, I'm not sure what they're trying to communicate the character's ending as. I think it's kinda supposed to give context to how they ended up in hell, but I'm assuming these were meant more as intro cutscenes than ending cutscenes, because that seems to be more in line with how a character's story would begin, rather than end. And it appears that they never finished the game's intro cutscene because the one that's used is just oddball's ending. Something that disappointed me, going through an entire character's playthrough just to get a cutscene I've already seen. Either way, once it's all said and done, you get booted back to the main menu. And something about this game's logo reminds me of the Tool album cover for 10,000 Days. The funny thing about Thrill Kill, it doesn't seem too bad. There's plenty of blood, gore, dismemberments, and even relative sexual themes, but I find this game kind of hilarious in a way. Because through all of it, it comes across as so try-hardy that it's kind of cute in a way. It's trying to be mature without actually being mature whatsoever, so it has the laughable air of a 5-year-old putting on dad's blazer and yelling at everybody about how grown up it is. Which I find quite amusing, but the gameplay, while passable, doesn't hold up to a modern lens all that well because of the stiff movement and relative repetition. Outside of the novelty of playing a functionally banned game, Thrill Kill is fun for a little while, but not a patch on a lot of other fighting games from the time and up to today. So it might keep you entertained for an hour or two, but beyond that, However, looking at it, it does seem relatively tame. It may not seem that bad, so why exactly did it get an adult-only rating that functionally killed it? Well, take into consideration the time period in which this game was set to come out. This was before things like GTA 3, when gaming, despite getting a reputation for ceaseless violence, was still very much perceived as a thing for kids. And media in general was a little bit more tame back then. You couldn't quite get away with as much on-screen violence back then without starting major controversies. These days, hyperviolence is a little bit more normalized in media, but back then, something even as comparatively tame as this could be considered too hot for release, so to speak. But then again, Mortal Kombat didn't get an adult-only rating. However, looking at it, despite being no more violent than Mortal Kombat, I can kinda see why Thrill Kill was given an AO rating over Mortal Kombat. What it comes down to is that the subject matter was just noticeably more upsetting to the average person at the time. Here's what I mean. Mortal Kombat is violent, but it's also set in a more fantastical world. Even beyond the crudeness, the mystical setting gives it a separation from reality that makes it less disturbing than Thrill Kill. Thrill Kill has a set of characters and environments that cut closer to the bone because they're more grounded. Instead of gods and monsters, you're faced with insane, disturbed people fighting in disgusting but nonetheless grounded environments. Ripping someone apart atop some fantastical structure is never going to be quite as uncomfortable to the average person as something like a couple of lunatics or disturbed people fighting in a grimy sewer, or a padded room for insane people that also happens to be smeared in blood and human shit. It's just a game that feels very grotty, and for the time especially, it pushed good taste to the absolute limit. You know, the same thing goes for something like Hatred. Is the game as violent as any number of games these days? No, not at all. It's actually fairly tame as far as the standards of modern gaming is concerned. But playing as a mass shooter, the subject matter is too disturbing and cuts too close to the bone, especially for a modern audience. Yes, it's not extremely violent. Yes, when you get into the game, it's so hilariously over the top that you can't take it seriously. Yes, there are other games where you can do essentially the same thing completely under your own volition, but it's the context that makes Hatred worthy of an adult-only rating. And the same goes for Thrill Kill. Despite both basically being relatively tame, from a third-party perspective, that is to say someone examining the game rather than experiencing it, it looks like too much. And that's why these controversies exist. But there's still no reason Thrill Kill couldn't have been toned down for an M rating, but instead it was full on cancelled. So what happened? Well, you remember how I said Virgin Interactive was the original publishers? Well, original is the operative word there because in 1998, EA purchased the North American division of Virgin Interactive. I have no idea why Virgin sold its video game division, considering it's a massive conglomerate, so you'd think having an extra subsidiary here and there wouldn't do them any damage, but I guess they weren't really turning a profit. Either way, when Thrill Kill was nearing completion, publishing rights as a result of this sale were handed over to Electronic Arts. The board of directors among Electronic Arts didn't like the game's extreme gratuitous violence and crude themes. As a matter of fact, EA was generally against violence in video games at the time because they were opposed to the negative reputation that video games were getting amongst the general public after so many controversies. So they were determined to not have the industry look bad by having the reputation of being exclusively for the demographics of kids and weirdos. No, they were just determined to make the industry look bad in every other possible way. So they made the decision to cancel the game right under the noses of Paradox Development. EA evidently didn't even inform them that the game was being cancelled, nor did they offer to let them sell the game to other publishers. EA just held onto the rights and told Paradox to blow it out their asses, because EA is a bucket of balls. What sucks even harder is that EA wasn't the one that fronted the bill. That was Virgin and Paradox themselves. EA could cancel this project with impunity because they didn't spend a dime on funding it. But thankfully it wasn't a major loss, because Paradox were able to repurpose the fighting engine into several other games and publish them under several less dickish publishers, some of which went on to be significant hits, including Wu-Tang Shaolin Style and the X-Men Mutant Academy games. And before officially closing their doors in 2008, they made some fairly critically acclaimed games beyond that. Most notably, the surprisingly excellent Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, which, by the way, I would really like a sequel to. Plus, as I said before, Thrill Kill, due to the unfortunate circumstances surrounding its cancellation, became possibly the most widely available piece of abandonware in history. To be honest, I think the game getting cancelled was kind of the best thing that could have happened to it. And I don't mean that in the snide way that it sounds, because if this game were released, it probably would have sold decently, but faded into obscurity within a couple of years to be held in such regard as games like Sentinel Returns or Loaded. But by being cancelled, it gave Thrill Kill sort of a Forbidden Fruit style mystique, elevating it almost to the level of urban legend. This was the game that was so violent and so vile that it couldn't be released. I've heard my Sonic fan friends describe a similar thing happening to Sonic CD. It was just known as a holy grail, an amazing game that nobody's ever played. And then it got a wider release and everybody collectively realized that it was just kinda there. I think a very similar fate would have befallen Thrill Kill if it came to that. So in this one rare instance, I think the universe kinda balanced itself out in favor of Paradox, which is more than can be said about the many studios that EA has screwed over throughout its long and bloody history. Still, I think somebody should see if they can wrestle the rights away from EA, because I would love to see a reimagining of Thrill Kill with modern technology. There's a shortage of good 3D fighters these days, and I would like to see what sick and twisted things someone could do with the concept and benefit of hindsight. But as for the PS1 game itself, yeah, it's not great. If I'm going to be breaking out the emulator, I'd much rather break it out to play something I can genuinely enjoy for more than an hour or two. But it's still fun while it lasts. That's all I got, so if you like this video and want to support my channel, please consider pledging to my Patreon like these fine fellows right here. And a special thanks to users Inutsu and Raf for going above and beyond. And if you want to support my channel for free, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Otherwise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions. Happy Halloween.